I turned this Victorian barn on my family's farm into an art studio. I moved to my grandmother's old farm a couple of years ago and started renovating one of the Victorian buildings to use as an art studio. The barn is a long brick building that had originally been used as a stable for the farm horses, then later converted for milking the dairy herd. After my grandmother retired from farming, the building fell out of use and has been empty ever since. I wanted to create a space where I could work on art and creative projects. The barn on the farm was an answer to this. I wouldn't have to pay rent and I could design the space however I wanted, but I would have to do all the work myself. This video is a roundup of all the things I did to transform the old derelict barn into a functional art studio. The barn was absolutely full of old beams, timbers, rotten gates, other bits of farm rubbish and things that had been stored in there for a long time. So the first thing I did was to start moving all of this stuff out. I shifted so much wood by hand, huge beams. I put them under the shed with other wood. The bit I was renovating is on the end of a long building. It would have been partly used for milking cows and also partly used as a stable. When I started this project, it hadn't really been used as a farm building for maybe 30 years. And before that, it had never really been cleaned out properly. After a couple of days, I'd cleared most of the bigger things and I was beginning to see the floor in the barn. There were some really big beams in there that I just couldn't move, so we got some help getting those out. Before I started any repair or mending, I wanted to remove all the old things that were rotten or broken. In the room that had been a stable, it had this wooden stable divider. The bottom of it was a bit rotten, and at some point somebody put on this piece of galvanized sheet metal which had gone all rusty. So to remove that, I got an angle grinder and cut through the nails and pulled it off the wall. Getting the angle grinder was a really good investment because it allowed me to also cut off all the old bits of metal that I didn't want. There were a lot of pipes along the walls, and while I decided to keep some of them, I wanted to remove others. So I cut through those and took them down. There were also lots of these metal troughs attached to the walls that were for feeding the cows when they were being milked. But they were completely fused and rusted, and it was impossible to get them off without cutting through the metal. In the other room, there were these metal dividers. I'm not sure what they were for, but they're part of the dairy equipment. The thing I realized is that everything is so solidly put together. Everything was tons of concrete and huge pieces of metal, and it was really built to last forever, which seems kind of silly considering how quickly technology moved on, and this kind of dairy system was obviously defunct and no longer useful. After I finished cleaning the place and removing the things I wanted to get rid of, it was a really nice moment to look around and maybe get an idea of what the place could become. The next thing I did was hire a pressure washer, which seems a bit crazy and maybe it wasn't the best idea, but I just wanted to try and clean some of the dirt off the walls and the ceiling. There was just so much of it. It was really useful for cleaning down the stable divider, which had a lot of dirt on the surface. I also mended the stable divider because in one area it was missing some boards. I couldn't find boards that matched, but I filled it in with some other reclaimed wood. Most of the roof in the building was in okay condition. There were a few holes in the slates, and the best way I could think to fill these was to use expanding foam. I realised that if I wanted to actually be able to use the space properly, I was going to have to get rid of the concrete troughs that lined the walls. And while I had a go with a sledgehammer myself, this just wasn't going to be something I could do. So we got some help doing that. Shaun and Dean came and used a jackhammer to break up the concrete, and then we removed all the rubble. Once we'd removed the concrete, I found that there was a gap in the floor, and I wanted to fill this in because I was really hoping to use this old original Victorian floor. I found some extra bricks around the farm, and I had a go at filling it with sand, leveling it, putting in the bricks, and I also poured cement onto it, which I'd never done before. I made it a bit watery, but it did actually work. After the floor, the next job was the walls. A lot of pointing was needed, a lot of mortar was missing, and some of the bricks were missing. My friend Scott showed me how to point and mix the mortar. Pointing is really slow work anyway, but I was obviously not a professional and there was a lot of it to do, so this took me quite a while. Once I'd mended and pointed the brick walls, I started painting them with the first coat of Limewash. I decided to use Limewash because the walls actually have some salts in them, and something called efflorescence forms on the outside of the bricks in some places. The thing about Limewash is that it's supposed to be breathable, and it's also kind of sacrificial. As the moisture and the salts come out of the bricks, the Limewash falls off and takes the salts away with it. So it means you have to replace the Limewash quite often, but it doesn't trap the moisture and the salts inside the walls like a lot of paints would do. I knew that I needed some insulation in this building. The rafters had spaces between them, and I realised I could put PIR board insulation in between them. I thought this would be pretty easy, and I ordered the boards, ordered a scaffold tower. It actually turned out to be kind of one of the worst parts of the job. The problem was that in this old building, the spaces between the rafters were not absolutely equal. Every one was slightly different, and to get a tight fit with the insulation board, I needed to measure each gap individually and cut a separate piece, specially to the right measurements for every single space. This just turned out to be exhausting because I had to go up and down the scaffold tower constantly to do the measuring. I had to come down and then do the cutting and then go up and then test it. And if it didn't fit, I had to come down and trim it. And this was just exhausting. The barn had a few windows that were completely rotten and most of the glass was broken or falling out. So I knew I needed to mend them. I had never made a window before, but there was a small window in one of the rooms that I decided to have a go at replacing. I found an old window that wasn't being used, and I took the wood from that, took it apart, cut it down, and made it into a window the right size. I really didn't know what I was doing though, and I put the window into the frame I made before I put the frame in the wall. It turned out to be hard to do it that way. I should have put the frame in and screwed that into the wall and then added the window. The window in the other room was mostly rotten at the bottom, so I scraped away what I could and replaced it with new wood. I I was definitely working this out as I went along, and the way I did it was probably not the most efficient. The building has an old kind of barn door which just sit on hinges on the outside of the building. They're definitely not watertight, airtight, any of that, and I really wanted to have proper exterior doors that would keep out the weather. To do this, I built some door frames to fill the spaces. I didn't make the doors at this point though, because I knew I needed to put in the floor first, and then I would be able to know the height that the doors needed to be. For the floor, I went through a lot of different ideas, and it was quite difficult because the two rooms had different floors at different levels. The floors weren't even. I was actually hoping at the beginning of the project to keep the Victorian brick floor in the stable part of the room, but I eventually realized that this just wasn't going to work because the floor was very uneven. I also found in the cold weather that it allowed a lot of moisture to come through the ground. So I settled on the idea of building a kind of frame to make a raised floor so that I could have a floor that was level across the whole of the studio. I started by putting in a couple of timbers that I knew were the height I wanted, and then I started working out from there using the spirit level to make sure everything else was the same level as those. There was a lot of timber under the farm shed that had been collecting over years and years, so that's what I was mostly using to do this. After a while though, I ran out of the really best pieces and I started having to hatch it together out of bits that weren't ideal. The way I supported it was I cut little pieces and stacked them up to make the right height, and then I nailed a bit of damp-proof course to the bottom of them. I knew that once the floor was down, I wouldn't be able to access what was underneath. So I took the opportunity to put a water waste pipe where I thought I was going to have a sink. The barn had two side doors and one larger door that I decided to make into double doors. The side doors I didn't think I would use on a daily basis, so I just made those ones that I could close from the inside. I'd never made a door before and I just kind of copied a picture I'd seen. For the double doors, I wanted to put glass in the top half of them so that it would be a bit like a window. The bottom half was kind of like the other doors I'd made, and the top half I made it in the same way as the window. They weren't the greatest doors ever. They're a little bit flimsy and they don't fit perfectly, but for now I'm pretty happy with them. Once spring arrived, I started painting everything. I primered and undercoated the windows, the doors. And I also wanted to have a colour change just to unify everything. So I took the big old barn doors off the outside and stripped them down so that I could repaint them a different colour. I wanted to get some electricity in the building, and I was hoping to run the cables underneath the floor through my frame I'd built. I did have the option to have the electrics on the outside of the walls using conduit, but I didn't really want plastic conduit all over the walls. I didn't think it would look that nice, and I thought it would get in the way of furniture and things like that. So I decided to do this thing I'd read about, which turned out to be one of the most horrible jobs. I wanted to cut the walls or chase the walls so that I could put the electric cables inside the walls. I realised that I should probably have done this earlier if I'd planned properly, because it involved cutting a channel in the bricks. I spent a lot of time wondering what kind of heating or stove I could put in, and I really wanted to build this thing called a masonry heater. I knew where I wanted it to be, and it was going to need some reinforced concrete underneath it. So before I put the floor in, I decided to pour this slab of concrete. Because the floor I was pouring it onto was already a big slab of concrete, I reinforced the concrete with the metal bars, more just because I had them and I thought it might as well be done. Trerry came to help put in the electricity, and we had to cut a lot of conduit to go under the floor. There was already electricity at the other end of the building, so it just had to be brought into the barn and then down the wall to travel through the floor to the socket places. Once this was done, I pointed up with mortar the places where I chased the walls for the cables. And after all this was done, I started on the final coat of Limewash for the walls. The Limewash was difficult at times to work with because it was very wet and sloppy, not like paint. It would drip everywhere, and it's also quite alkaline, so it can irritate your skin. The advantage of the wooden floor frame was that I could put mineral wool insulation underneath the floor. I started this job in the really, really hot summer, and while it was a bit miserable wearing the suit and the gloves, it actually didn't take that long, and I got it done in about a day. To cover the floor, I ordered tongue and groove boards. I considered hiring a floorboard nailer. But in the end, I just did it by hand using nails and a hammer. I'd never put a floor in before, but I watched videos about how to do it, and it turned out to be a really enjoyable job. The only big mistake I made was not anticipating that each floorboard needed to finish over a batten. All this really meant was that I had underestimated how much wood I needed, so I had to order more. But otherwise, this job went really well, and I actually enjoyed it a lot. This was a really exciting time for this project, partly because it was nice summer weather, but also because putting the floor in felt like everything was coming together and it was beginning to feel like a real indoor space rather than just an old barn. Getting the floor finished also meant that I could put in the doors, which I had made quite a while ago, and I was really excited to do this. Hanging the doors was actually quite fiddly. I hadn't done this before, and I definitely didn't really know what I was doing at first. It was an amazing feeling to walk into the studio after I'd finished the floor and put the doors on. It felt like such a milestone after so much work. I wanted to put a sink in one corner of the room, so I needed to build a bit of a kitchen countertop. I used an old table which I cut down to size, and from there I built onto it the frame that I needed for the kitchen unit. The sink I used was an old ceramic one that I found actually in the garden and I cleaned up. I also put up a shelf above the kitchen unit so that I could put cups and tea and things like that. I decided to build a desk along one of the walls in the other room. I found some long boards and put them together. One of the other things I couldn't do by myself was replace the glass in the big arch window. Steve and Adam came with the piece of glass and installed it. I had really wanted to make this thing called a masonry heater that I'd read about. It's a kind of wood stove, but it's built into a mass of masonry, and the idea is that that masonry absorbs much more of the heat and radiates it out into the room. It's supposed to be a way of heating with wood that uses a lot less fuel, and I thought this sounded like a really great thing. I actually ordered some plans to do this and build it myself, but I discovered when I started looking into it that it was going to be really hard to get the parts I needed. This was really disappointing because it made me realize I probably couldn't afford to do this at this stage, and I would have to choose a different method of heating. I eventually decided just to get a small wood stove and put that in the space. This doesn't mean that I can't build the masonry heater in future if I want to, but for now, this is what I chose to do. Now that the studio is finished, I'm so happy with it. It's such a nice space to be in, and it's an amazing feeling to remember what it used to be like. I really can't believe the transformation, and I'm so proud of myself for doing this and for getting through even the really hard bits. One of the things I think about is the past lives of this space. At one time, there would have been a horse living in here. There would have been cows coming in every day to be milked. There would have been my ancestors and maybe other farmers doing their daily tasks in here. I'm really glad to give this building a new life, because for 30 years it just was empty, and it's so nice now that it's a really lovely space to be in and a place that means I can work on my creative things.